hopefully you're here for this presentation on Jenkins and not for something else. A little bit about myself. I have been working with Drupal since 2008, been with Acquia since 2014. I also write quite a bit. I write blog posts. I wrote a book. I actually have a few little coupon things. These say on them 25% off, but I made the coupon 100% off. So throughout the presentation, I'll try to give a few of these copies out. The cool thing about the way that I'm publishing this book, it's on LeanPub. So anytime that there's updates to Ansible, I update the book. The book has complete automated test coverage as well. So I update the book examples, and then you get them for free. It's a nice model. I also call myself an automator of things because that's kind of what I do at Acquia. That's what I do for my personal projects. I wish I could do that for things like gardening because everything that I grow at my house ends up dying a year later or a week later. But for the first one of these, who knows the reference in this picture and in the title?
It's Stanley Kubrick, but I don't need the book, I bought it.
Okay, well, someone else. What's the title of the movie?
Stop worrying and love the top.
Yeah, Dr. Strangelove, and that's what's his name?
Peter Sellers.
Peter's. You
No,
know?
I already bought your book.
Oh.
It's excellent.
Okay.
So
Here you go.
someone else.
Free book for you.
She bought the book.
Did anybody here not get my book? All right, so with this presentation is going to be kind of simple, but towards the end, I figure I want to give everybody a good kind of broad overview of Jenkins, because some people here, who here has ever used Jenkins at all? So there's a good number. A lot of people have never used it. Some people might have used it on a project, but they never set it up and they never configured it. So I want to go from the beginning of what is it, how do you use it, how do you set it up, and then get into how to use it with Drupal. And then finally, at the end, we can kind of get deeper into things if you want to see some of the examples and stuff like that. So a little history on the project. Originally, a long time ago, it was called Hudson, and it was developed by a guy at Sun Microsystems. Unfortunately, at some point in the history, a big company called Oracle bought Sun Microsystems, and they started screwing with all these open source projects that were amazing. And that led to some internal strife in the Hudson team, and the guy who created it eventually, Oracle says he forked it. He says he renamed the project, and Oracle forked it. But basically, they came up with a new name, and it was called Jenkins. So eventually, many years later, Jenkins came under the purview of a company called CloudBees. It's still completely open source. It's still primarily a Java-based tool, and it's if you use Java, it's like the shoe-in for anything CI. But it's a Java-based tool that is well-maintained, has constant updates, has a very large community, and is under the stewardship of CloudBees now. For another one of these copies of the book, who can tell me another popular software product that Oracle has bought out as part of their buyout of Sun and kind of...
MySQL.
You have a copy of the book yet? Okay, here you go.
There's VirtualBox account.
I haven't gotten to that yet. No. We could
also do OpenOffice.
I think OpenOffice. There's a number. Sun was highly productive, and Oracle was highly seductive, I guess, in terms of the money.
Yeah, they did OpenOffice, which is why LibreOffice exists.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Oracle is great for causing forking?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you want to get your open source project forked, then go to Oracle. Back in the early 2000s, I forget, 2004 or something, it was when Hudson was originally made. It became super popular in Sun. It was open source. It became super popular everywhere because CI was a pretty new thing. At least open source CI was a pretty new thing back then. And by 2007, 8, 9, it was basically the only open source CI tool. Since Jenkins UI and paradigms and all that kind of just stayed the exact same from 2001 to 2011, 12, 13, all of a sudden people realized, oh, people want usability and people want to be able to do things in a language besides Java. So all these other things have since come into being. And some of them integrate a little better, a little worse with different products like Travis CI if you use GitHub, Travis, Circle CI, some other tools are click a button and you're all integrated. Jenkins, a little bit more work, but it is open source and free for private projects, so that's nice. But there's a lot more tools today, so Jenkins has to be more competitive. Getting started with getting Jenkins onto a server somewhere so you can start using it. A few of the considerations that you need to make, one is RAM. Jenkins is a hungry butler. It needs lots of RAM, it's basically as much as you can give it. It will run on a 1 gigabyte VPS or on like a 1 gigabyte virtual machine, something like that, but it doesn't run well and it will kill itself when it hits out of memory issues. Even if you're just doing things like cron jobs and stuff, Jenkins likes lots of RAM. So 2 gigs, 4 gigs minimum requirement. If you're doing a lot of things, a lot of Drupal sites, you might want to go 8 gigs, 16 gigs, or also spread out jobs on multiple slaves. I'm not going to get into that in this presentation. CPU, not usually that important to have like super beefy CPU on your server that runs Jenkins, unless you have jobs that do tons and tons of work in PHP and Node.js and stuff. If it's just building a project and running tests, it doesn't need to have something crazy. Another thing that's important is don't ever fill up the system disk. Jenkins doesn't handle that too gracefully. What it does is it just stops running jobs, and it doesn't tell you anything about it. There might be a log message, but make sure that you monitor these things. So have either just log into the server and run top, or have a tool monitoring these things and make sure that you're not hitting your limits, and if you are, you might need to upgrade your server. Also, I do run Jenkins a lot of times on a really small server, like a 512 meg VPS, just because it's super duper cheap. And if we didn't have it running, we wouldn't automate anything. So having something is better than nothing. So in the presentation, which I'll link later, there's a shell script that I have that I run as a cron job on those smaller servers, which is on GitHub's gist, that you can copy and paste, and it just makes sure the service is running. And this projector does this in this room. I don't know why. So, installing Jenkins. It's really simple, right? You just install Java, install Jenkins, and you're done. It's just like Apache Solr. Except Jenkins is a lot more complex beast. And one thing that some people might not realize is when you automate things with Jenkins, you put all your keys and API keys and your SSH keys and all these things into Jenkins. If somebody gets control of it, it's going to completely own and demolish your infrastructure because they have the keys to the kingdom. So, of the people who have run a Jenkins server, have you ever seen a Jenkins server look like this after a year or two? Anybody? I have, I know. Pretty much every Jenkins server I've ever seen ends up like this. The problem is people don't update it. People don't maintain the server. People don't have any sort of testing for things they do, so they add in a plugin and it messes everything up, and then their Jenkins is hosed forever. I've been in a lot of organizations where they have like a list of their Jenkins servers, and then there's a column that says, has it been hacked yet? And like 90% of them are yes, because they're running like a 3-year-old version of Jenkins, because everybody's scared of upgrading because they have these plugins that are 3 years old that all their stuff is dependent on, but the server's hacked, but it still has to run because they're dependent on it to do their business operations. It's not a good situation.
Whoops.
It's like a Drupal site. I know people who have not updated their Drupal sites from 7.6 or 8 or whatever it is. You know,
I have
Drupal.
6.
Drupal. I mean, if you're running Drupal 6 and you have drop guard, my drop
Wizard.
Yeah.
my drop wizard. That's it. I would still get to Drupal 7 as soon as you can, but it's the name of the game in software is updating. So there's the way that I recommend installing Jenkins, and the way that I do it is you want it to be secure first of all, because if you're like, let's say you're on the wonderful open Wi-Fi here, and you log into your Jenkins server and it's on HTTP, anybody with a laptop here could immediately pick up your login credentials, get into your Jenkins server, and do anything that you could, including like deleting a code base or deploying new code or changing the checked out branch on a Drupal site. Or if it's a more boring server, just running your VHAT tests and seeing how cool they are.
Why do you get VPN?
Yeah, VPN is an option, but for a public server, like a lot of times it's a group of people that's remote or something that I'm working with. So I have Nginx and Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt generates a cert and keeps the cert active, and Nginx proxies all the traffic to Jenkins. And you can also do some other things to make the installation a little bit more secure with that. But in general, having it behind HTTPS only is nice. And I hate that because it's still recording, believe me, but it just keeps hiding itself on the screen. Unless
So you just use Nginx as a front-end reverse proxy then?
Yep, yeah. Nginx is just a proxy. So the other thing that I encourage is Jenkins is a CI tool, and you're going to start using CI as a cultural thing at your company or for your projects. Wouldn't it be good to have CI for your CI so that you can actually make sure that your testing and your integration and your deployments work before you make updates to all that stuff? So I always make sure that there's actual CI for the Jenkins instance. So I don't just deploy an update to Jenkins and hope, as I think Chris Urban yesterday in our other presentation, what was the quote? Like, cross your fingers, pray.
Pray.
If it works, it's in prod and it's done. That's not how I want my Jenkins server to run, especially if I'm dependent on it for code deploys or for code builds, things like that.
Dumb luck.
Dumb luck, yeah. I don't want dumb luck managing my Drupal sites. You wouldn't develop a Drupal site in production, would you? So why would you develop all of your automation in production? That sounds like a recipe for disaster. If you run a job and you accidentally had the wrong parameter and you had prod in where it should be dev, all of a sudden your prod environment gets locked off from the world and bad things can happen. So you want to be able to test things locally and to run Jenkins locally and make changes locally and then put them onto production in an automated fashion, repeatedly. If you want to skip ahead about 1,000 steps, I have a GitHub repo that I built for this presentation. Unfortunately, I was going to do a few more things with it, but I ended up in the hospital a couple weeks ago, so I did not get to do a couple of those things. But it's pretty complete, and I'm going to keep working on it after this because I'm actually now using it to manage some of my Drupal sites, because it's better than the old Jenkins server setup that I was using. If you want to do something that's a little easier for Jenkins management, there is a platform or product as a service as a service, I don't know, CI as a service through CloudBees. So you can get all the same stuff with Jenkins, but managed, hosted by them with some of their security and tools and things, and they guarantee that it's always up to date. You have engineers available. It's a bit more expensive though than having an open source tool. It's kind of the same thing as like if you ran your site through Squarespace or Wix, you're paying a lot more than if you use Drupal, which is free, but you're responsible for Drupal updates and stuff like that. But it's basically the name of the game if you want hosted Jenkins. If you want to use it right now during this presentation and stop listening to me, you can use Docker, this command. And that'll bring up their basic, like the latest demo Docker container running Jenkins with Blue Ocean. I'll talk a little bit more about Blue Ocean in a bit. So you have Jenkins set up, let's say using that Docker thing or using the linked project that I was working on. Once you're in, there's a few things that you might need to configure. Some of them are more pressing than others, but this is another reason why I like doing it locally before I go to production, because if you build a Jenkins server in production, at least in the old days, it used to not even be protected. There was no admin login by default. So you'd install Jenkins, and then if somebody else got to it before you, they could lock you out of it. That's never a good thing. Or sometimes you install Jenkins, you log in, and you change a setting, and then it locks you out. And that's never a good thing either. So it's good to do this locally first. Get your feet wet. The first thing that you'll probably want to do, and it's something that you'll do forever basically when you're using Jenkins, is start evaluating what plugins are necessary for your work. Plugins are very much like Drupal modules, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. Just like with Drupal modules, that's a good thing and a bad thing. Some plugins break everything every few months. Other plugins are stable and reliable and awesome all the time. But you'll end up using at least 5 or 10 plugins, sometimes 20, 30, 40 plugins on a Jenkins instance to help make things faster, easier, more convenient. And plugins do everything from like making it so you can interact with GitHub directly, so you can have commits on GitHub, trigger builds in Jenkins, or do things like put timestamps in your build log so you can see how long things take, that kind of stuff. One of the biggest plugin suites, which is slowly becoming basically, I'm guessing what like Jenkins 3.0 will be, is called Blue Ocean. And like I said earlier, Jenkins was the name of the game and the state of the art in 2004, 2005, to like 2009, 10, 11. But a lot of people started realizing that some of these other new tools, Circle CI and GitLab CI and Travis CI and all these other ones, some of them even open source, they were a lot more usable, they were a lot more user-friendly, and they also did things like, instead of having to click through an interface to build a job, you could just throw a file in your repository, and then when you added it to the system, it would start building it automatically. Jenkins has that now through Blue Ocean and pipelines, but there's still, the major effort went into it, what was it, 2014, 15, 16, and it's still not the default. So the default is still the old ancient interface, which they have Retina graphics, which is nice, but it's still the ancient. Like if you used Hudson and Jenkins today, a lot of it is just exactly the same, just nicer icons. So Blue Ocean is just a complete rewrite of the interface, and it's a lot more usable. It's a lot more friendly towards the people that will actually build the jobs. Like the old Jenkins interface is really friendly for the people that build your automation, but if you build automation the right way, you're doing it like for 2% of the time, and you're using it like 98% of the time. So it's better to target the 98%. So there's an issue if you want to follow it. It's linked in here. Eventually, it's going to be the default. So instead of logging into Jenkins and getting that old interface, you get the new one, and that'll be nice because the only way to do that now is to use Nginx and to rewrite requests to /blue, and that's kind of annoying to me. Another thing that's important in configuring a Jenkins server, because generally speaking, and I would recommend this, Jenkins should be completely separate from like your Drupal server or any other servers that you're running for many reasons, isolation and the fact that, well, I'll get to it in a minute. But basically, you're going to be putting things into Jenkins to let you be able to access other tools and code bases and things. So one thing to keep in mind there is, if you can, don't give it the keys to the kingdom. Give it the keys that it needs just to do what it needs to do. So like, if it just needs to check out a code base on GitHub and deploy it, you don't need to give it push access to your GitHub code base. So use a GitHub deploy key with read-only access. Don't use your like personal key that can do anything to any GitHub repo that you own. I've seen that happen a lot of times, and that's an easy way to get hacked. API keys and things like that, usually what you would do is store them in the Jenkins home directory. There's other ways to do it. You can also use like key store systems and things, but there's some plugins for it, but it gets kind of complicated and doesn't work with everything. So one thing to keep in mind is that you need to be careful and vigilant about who has admin level access to Jenkins, because all these things, basically they're files on a file system that somebody could read if they get access. Let's see. And this is the interface that comes with Jenkins for if you need to add like a SSH key. You can either enter it in directly and it stores it in a little file in the Jenkins home folder. You can have it stored somewhere on the Jenkins server and it could read it in. You can also add usernames and passwords and API keys and things. And then Jenkins gives these credentials to any job that needs them. There's ways to make it a little more limited, so you have like a credential that only these jobs can use and a credential that only these jobs use. But that's a little more complicated than I'm going to get into today. And like I said earlier, be careful who has access to Jenkins admin. Basically, if you have a default Jenkins instance, you just installed it and you create a new user account, that new user account has all privileges and rights just like you do. So basically, unlike Drupal, where every new user just has like admin or authenticated user, and it has like 2 permissions, in Jenkins, every user gets root basically to Jenkins. And so if you have files in your Jenkins home that have credentials in them, that new user could write a Jenkins job that cats a file out, and then they could grab your keys and do things with it. So another thing that's important in a Jenkins server is making sure that you have good access control. So the way that I usually do this is using the role strategy plugin. And if you use Drupal, this is like, I don't know, it's like halfway between what Drupal's groups and users, or not groups, what is it called? Is it groups? Roles, yeah, permissions and roles. It's kind of like Drupal's permissions and roles, but it can be a little bit more daunting at first, because it's like, you want to do it by job or globally? And it's like, that's the only option. So you can do it by job, and like every single job you have to configure who has access to read, write, see the workspace, run it, see the builds, all that kind of stuff. Another thing to be careful of is the workspace itself. When you're setting up permissions for a Jenkins server, if somebody has access to the workspace, and part of your code build job does something that like writes a file to the code base that has an API key or access key in it, and then it puts that code onto your production server or something like that. Anybody with read access to the workspace could technically get at that key. So one thing I usually do is there's a plugin called the Workspace Cleanup plugin. It deletes the workspace after a job. Sometimes that's not something you want to do actually, but you have to be careful about who has access to the workspace for anything that would do something that writes secrets to the workspace. I'm going to grab a quick drink. Backing up Jenkins is actually surprisingly easy. Jenkins does everything under the sun inside its Jenkins home folder. There are very specialized advanced use cases where that's not the case, but 99.9% of the time, everything that you need in a Jenkins installation is inside Jenkins home, so you literally just zip that home folder, put it somewhere, and you have a backup. So what I usually do is I have an Amazon S3 bucket, and it costs like 7 cents a month to have like 60 days of backups, unless you have gargantuan code bases that you're backing up, which is a really bad idea. And good reason to clean up your workspaces. But anyway, I have an Ansible playbook, I think this is. Let me click on it. Yeah, it's an Ansible playbook that grabs the Jenkins home. It makes sure there's a bucket named Jenkins backup, in my case. It syncs the contents. There's actually an Ansible module for this, but Amazon S3 sync was causing weird issues. And then it makes sure that it's there and prints out, like, here's where your backup is. So that's nice. And that's what I usually do is I put that playbook on the server in the Jenkins home folder, and then I have a Jenkins job that runs every night, and it just does that, and it zips it up with a timestamp. And if your Jenkins home is small, it's, like I said, like pennies to do backups on S3. If your Jenkins home is huge, you might want to change the way that you use the backup, or you might want to exclude. I think that script actually excludes workspaces, but you'll have to see in your own usage. So finally, Jenkins and Drupal. That's why we're here. What are some things that we can do with Jenkins and Drupal? Well, anything that you do manually, you can do it with Jenkins. Anything that you do in Travis CI or other things, you can do it with Jenkins too. Some of the most common things are on here: running tests, building dependencies. So a lot of people use Jenkins. Like at Acquia, we have a tool called BLT, Build and Launch Tools. And it actually, by default, uses Travis CI, but you can use it with Jenkins. And in your code base, you just have a composer.json, your tests, and custom code. Like, that's all you have in your code base. So your code base could be like 100 kilobytes. You don't have to include Drupal core and all the modules and patches and all that junk. And then what BLT does is every time you commit code, it builds the code base on Travis or Jenkins or wherever, and then it runs your tests, and then it does everything. And if you have it configured, it'll also deploy it to your development environment. So that's one thing that a lot of people use Jenkins for, because it's really annoying to have to do that by hand. And your options are basically either somebody does that by hand every time you deploy code, or you automate it in Jenkins, and you don't have to worry about it ever again. Another thing that Jenkins can be useful for is running cron. A lot of people just set up a cron job on a server, or if you're using a hosting provider, you can run cron usually in their interface somewhere. But you might need more specialized control over the cron or scheduling. Jenkins has pretty flexible scheduling. You can also set it so that like cron could be run after certain things happen. So a lot of people who need more advanced things done with cron end up running it through a tool like Jenkins instead. You can also deploy new sites. So in the example that I'm giving, I'm doing a multi-site install. So this is one of the things I didn't get to do before today. But you could have a playbook or a script or something that sets up a new database, installs Drupal, and makes sure everything's in line for a new multi-site site. Or even if you're using like Amazon Route 53, you could do everything. Like say, I need a new website. I need Jeff Geerling's jenkinsstuff.com. You just type in the website name, and it would do everything from giving you a domain name to building the folder and everything in your code base, pulling the code base, building the database, building your site. It's like it could be a poor man's way of getting like an automated site builder tool going. Another thing that a lot of people do is deploying updates. So instead of just automatically deploying things to dev or stage or prod if you have multiple environments. Like what I usually do is I have one production server and then my local environment for a Drupal site. So when I want to deploy something, I commit things to my code base and then I click a button in Jenkins and it deploys it to my production site. Instead of doing it automatically, I like doing it on my own. And so for a quick little demo, I think I'm going a little bit fast, but for a quick little demo, I have my Jenkins project set up, and I'm going to use it on my Midwestern Mac LLC website, which is on a server that's actually running Drupal 7. I have one that's running Drupal 8, but there's only one site on it, so I didn't get to test like multi-site stuff. And it has 6 different sites on it. And here's a quick demo of how I have that set up using this installation. So let me go quickly to GitHub. Drupal Jenkins multi-site. So this is the project I was mentioning earlier. And it has, as I said, you can install it locally, so you can test things out and build things locally before you go to production. And it also has a production setup so that you can use like VPS anywhere. As long as you have root access, you can do it. And it will build everything the same way in production as you have on local. The local setup uses Docker. And a fun thing I just found out last night is that you can actually run Docker containers inside Docker containers. So like I can do all my CI stuff inside Docker that uses Docker, and I didn't think I'd be able to do that. So that was cool. And it has an MIT license. So if you want to take this code and completely modify it for your needs, go ahead, fork it. I'm completely happy with that. And this setup depends on an Ansible playbook that uses a bunch of my Ansible rules. So there's a lot of these Geerling guy rules. But it sets up a bunch of different things for my Jenkins server that I use as tools to help me automate a little easier. So I'm using Ansible. I'll show you how I use that in a minute. Certbot is the tool that gets certificates from Let's Encrypt. I use Docker containers to do things like build Composer dependencies. That way I don't have to install PHP and Composer and all these other tools on the Jenkins server. I try to limit the Jenkins server to just like Java, Jenkins, Nginx, like as small as possible. Now there's some other tools you might need like Git, but keeping the attack surface small on the server is a very good thing when you have the keys to the kingdom on your server. So then there's Java and Jenkins. Of course, Java is required to run Jenkins. And then I have Git, Nginx, which is just used to serve the SSL for the site, basically. It's a reverse proxy. And then I have a security role that does what I call it, well, I don't call it, everybody calls it, the first 5 type setup steps. It locks down SSH access. It installs fail to ban, so that if somebody tries brute forcing your server, they'll get blocked. Some of those kind of things. Sets up automated security updates for Ubuntu or sent to us. And then I have a firewall that's just sets up IP tables rules so that you can only get access to like Jenkins, and that's it, and SSH. And then pip is used with Ansible to do a few of the automation steps. So once you get all that set up, it installs a Jenkins server. And I had enough time to get these 4 jobs done just to show you a sample of some of the jobs that I would build. Personally, my convention is always to have snake case, is it? Yeah, not camel case. So it's snake case where it's all lowercase with underlines instead of spaces, because when you're automating things with Jenkins, you can use spaces, but spaces cause all kinds of weird issues. So I use this kind of format for jobs. Other people don't. But as a simple example, I actually made an update to my code base, that multi-site code base. So if I go to midwesternmac.com, if I go to available updates, I find that Honeypot's out of date. So I just grabbed the module. This is a Drupal 7 site. It's super old-fashioned, so I downloaded the module and drug it into my code base. It was very barbarian feeling. But anyway, so I did all that, and I committed it. Now I want to deploy that code. Since this is a multi-site, there's 6 Drupal sites, but there's one code base. So a code deploy is just literally putting that code on the server and then running updates and clearing caches for each of those sites. So I'll show you how that's, well, actually, let's do it first. So Jenkins gives you a nice live view of what's going on the server and gives you console output. And I use a plugin to give timestamps so I can see how long things take. And you can see it deployed the code. Before this was the commit on the server, and after that was the commit. So that's all nice and good. And now it's going through all the sites on the server, Midwestern Mac, jeffgeerling.com, carry of ours, before I do STL. So it's going through all these sites, and it's running database updates, and then it's clearing caches on each one using Drush. And I'll show you how that's done in just a minute once it's finished. There we go. And at the end, it's always wonderful to see that success. So if I go back to the project, I can show you how this is set up. I used to do, like for something simple like this, I used to do a lot of things using like an SSH wrapper for a command or something, but that it was always more complicated. Things always got messed up. So now I use Ansible. I call this the poor man's Ansible, where you're not actually using like Ansible playbooks. You just literally use Ansible to run a command on a server. And the way this is set up is there's what Ansible calls an inventory file that says MM for Midwestern Mac. MM is here. It just tells you, here's the server. It's out there at midwesternmac.com or whatever. So I say Ansible, and then I tell it what servers to work on. In this case, just MM is the one server. And then use the Git module. And then these are arguments to Ansible to tell it what to do. So it's saying, go to my Git repository, and then check out the master branch, the latest version of master. Make sure it updates to the latest commit, and stick it into this folder. Make sure that it's there. So a cool thing about the way that Ansible does this is it actually will check and see, is that already done? If it is, it will say changed equals false, and it'll just tell you like I didn't do anything because it's already there. But in our case, it did see an update, so you saw the commit hash changed, and it said changed equals true. And then I have just an array here of all the different websites that are on that multi-site, and it loops through the array and runs Drush updb and Drush ccall. I could have been a little more fancy and used my Git aliases, which are actually in my code base, but I didn't have this job use the code base kind of intentionally because I'll show you that in a few minutes. So this is like super simple. And using Ansible, it makes it really easy to just run commands on a remote server as long as you have SSH access to the server. Or if it's local, like if you did do something against my recommendation and run Jenkins and Drupal on the same server, which would often end up in either Jenkins blowing up or Drupal blowing up, then you wouldn't even need to use Ansible. You could just use Drush directly, but I don't highly recommend that. Anyway, so that's how that works. And then there's another couple jobs here. Cron run, this is just to show how simple it is to run cron on a remote server with Jenkins. I use the same thing, Ansible, operate on the Midwestern Mac server. And then if you don't provide, so Ansible, like this is a module. If you don't provide a module, it defaults to the command module, which literally runs the string as a command on the server. So I just have it run drush core cron. And I have a variable here, website, so I can choose which of the 6 websites it runs cron on. So if I go back here and build it, I can choose which website I want to run cron on, jeffgeerling.com. Go here and I can watch the output. And of course it goes away. Moving the mouse. There we go, okay. So if I go to jeffgeerling.com, it should show that cron ran very recently. If I go to the status report, last run 17 seconds ago. So that's nice. Oh, and I'll show you, I'll prove that the Midwestern Mac update has been applied. If I go to available updates, Honeypot should be up to date. So that's good too. So for something like cron, like I said earlier, it's something that Jenkins can automate and have it run like every 5 minutes or every hour or whatever. And there's a plugin called Build Periodically with Parameters. It's the parameterized trigger plugin. Because out of the box it comes with this build periodically, and you can just say like run it every 5 minutes. But if you have parameters like which website, you might want to have like every 5 minutes for jeffgeerling.com, but every day for something else that doesn't get much traffic. So you can actually add schedules for each parameter, and it gives you the syntax for that here. Let's see. So let me go to did code deploy, did cron run. Database backup is another one that's nice. Or you can, like if you're using, what's the module, backup and migrate. If you're using that, which I also don't recommend, but if you are using that, you can have it like build a zip file of your tarball or something of your code base and database and then ship it somewhere. Or you can use Drush. Drush now has the ability to build like your entire code base and files in your database and then put it somewhere. But I usually back up everything separate. So this one just does the database. And it's, again, very simple. It has the selection of the website as a parameter. And then it uses Ansible. First it does a Drush SQL dump. And it compresses it, and it dumps it into a particular file. And then it copies it to this server. So it copies it from the destination, like from the web server to the Jenkins server. And then it deletes it from the web server. And then I didn't implement this because I didn't get time to stick my Amazon credentials for Jenkins into here yet. But the last step would be copying it up to S3 and deleting it from the server. So that's another thing. And just like with the cron, usually you'd want to do that like daily or weekly or whatever the schedule is that you need. Let's see, the last one. So the last test takes 5 minutes to run. So I'm going to be kicking that one off and then getting back to the end of my presentation. I'll show you all the wonderful magic at the end. There was a good presentation on VHAT that I highly recommend if you need to know more about behavioral testing by Steve Hirsch. Yeah, it was a little bit earlier today. I'm sure that Kevin Thill already has it up on YouTube for you to watch. But this will take prod.drupalvm.com. This production demo website actually has it's kind of like my canary in the coal mine for Drupal VM. It's a live production website that's running on Drupal VM's stuff on a DigitalOcean droplet. And the code base has bhat tests, and it has integration with Varnish and a bunch of other things. I'm kind of just using it to make sure that everything I do in Drupal VM doesn't blow up everybody's stuff all the time, which it hasn't, because I have this thing that tells me when it does. So that's nice. But it comes with some bhat tests, and I have this job that will, when I schedule it and start it, what it will do is it actually uses Jenkins Git integration, and it clones the repository into the Jenkins workspace. It builds a Docker container, which it's doing right now, local Drupal VM. It builds a Docker container. It builds the code base inside the Docker container using Composer, and then it uses bhat to run, then it installs Drupal with Drush, then it uses bhat to run all the behavioral tests, so that every time that I commit code, I can have the bhat tests all run automatically. I didn't integrate this directly with GitHub so that every commit triggers a build, but you can do that if you're on a public server. If you're on your local host, GitHub can't call localhost because that wouldn't work, because it's local to you and not GitHub. So anyway, while this goes, it takes a while because downloading every dependency ever. While that goes, I'll show you really quick how it works, and then we'll get back to the tail end of the presentation and open it up for some discussion. So this one, again, is pretty darn simple. Instead of using Ansible this time, it's using Docker to do everything. The first step is it integrates with Git, so this is a GitHub repository. You can actually clone it, and it includes, as a bonus, all of the secrets encrypted with Ansible Vault. So if you can crack Ansible Vault, you could have all of the keys to the kingdom for Drupal VM live. They're all in the code base. But I don't think you'll be able to do that until you have a quantum computer. So this uses the Git integration to check out the master branch. You can also have it check out multiple branches, or check out a different branch, or have a parameter as the branch name, that kind of thing. And then it uses Docker Compose to build the built-in Docker Compose file that comes with Drupal VM. And then it installs the Composer dependencies. It just uses Composer install. Then it installs the site using Drush. And then it uses bhat to run the bhat Docker configuration, which I can't scroll very well. It runs the bhat Docker configuration, which just tells it which tests and where to look for things and all that. And once it finishes, you'll be able to see the wonderful result of that. So before you get to see that, since it's going to take a few minutes, and I'm glad I plugged in my computer because the CPU is like 400% now, I will go to the end. So one thing that I often run into is I'm like, man, I just did that thing 2 times. I should spend like 6 hours automating it. Sometimes I actually do that, and then I realize, oh, I've only ever done that 3 times, and it takes like 5 minutes, so I shouldn't have spent 6 hours automating it. So of course there's this wonderful XKCD comic that gives you a good chart of like, when you're thinking about automating something you do with Drupal, make sure that it's the what is it? The Riskreward, not Riskreward. Make sure that the ends justify the means. Or ROI. Make sure the ROI is there. Yes, that's business speak that I don't ever remember. Anyways, so a lot of the things like running Drupal cron, it's a very quick thing if you want to go into the interface and do it, but you're going to do it every 5 minutes through the night. You don't want to be up at night clicking run cron on your Drupal site, so automate it. But if it's like you're storing a database. If you have a big website, you probably want to automate that for safety's sake. But if you have a website that has very low traffic, like some of the sites that I run on my thing get like 12 visits a day, I don't need to have automation for a database or store. I can just be like, oh, the website's down, and like a day later spend some time and stick the database back up there. So anyway, that's all that I have in this presentation. But there's tons of great information. I want to give a special shout out to Chromatic and Lullabot, who, like a lot of times when I'm stuck on something in Jenkins, I'm like searching on Google and it's like, oh, Chromatic has an article on that. Oh, Chromatic has an article on this. So there are definitely a lot of Drupal companies using a lot of Jenkins, and a lot of the companies do a great job of like showing like, here's the best way to do this. Here's how we did this. And another thing that I didn't touch on much is Drupal 8 specific stuff. Because this particular site that I was demoing is a Drupal 7 site. But Chromatic has some good information on how they do deploys and backups and things. Phil Norton also has an old presentation from 2013, but it's highly relevant because, as I said, Jenkins hasn't really changed since 2004 in terms of the UI. So once Blue Ocean comes out, everything you've learned about the way that you click around in Jenkins becomes worthless. But that's life in software development. So that is all that I have. I'm gonna switch back to the demo over here and let it run. But questions and discussion back there first.
What advantages do you see of Jenkins over GitLab CI or some of the other competitors?
And Jenkins has a huge system of plugins that GitLab still doesn't match perfectly. The other thing that seems to be, I don't know, the other thing that I don't like all the time about GitLab and GitLab CI in particular, the resource usage has been worse than Jenkins sometimes for me. And some of the things that they use are really complicated. They're very cool, but they're really complicated. And Jenkins, it's literally a Java blob of Java, and it spits out a very detailed log. And when things go wrong, it's pretty easy to figure out what went wrong, and 99% of the time it's out of memory. With GitLab, sometimes I've hit issues that took longer to debug. It's getting a lot better. The last time I really used GitLab in earnest was about a year ago, and things have gotten a lot better. But if you're completely new to it all, I wouldn't say definitely use Jenkins. I'd say look at a couple options. Use the quick start, like run the Jenkins Docker container, run the GitLab Docker container, see which one really fits with your model of how things should work. Because it should be pretty easy to get the first couple things going. If it takes you 6 hours to get cron running through your CI tool, you might not want to use that CI tool. Sadly, if it takes you 6 hours to set up Drupal, and, which for a lot of people it does, then is it really, So we're working on that though. There's a core issue for it. This finished. So at the end, it installed Drupal here, and then it runs a test Drupal context. And in order to prove that Behat is working correctly, as a developer, I need to run a simple interface test. And it says, given I'm on the home page, then I should see no front page content has been created yet. So that's about it. Very simple, but if you had a suite of tests, you could have different parts of it run by tags, or you could run them all. You can also, what a lot of people do is they have like their essential tests, like every time we commit, we want to run 10 or 20 tests that make sure little things are working. But before we go to prod, we want to make sure everything works, and it's like a 3-hour test. Sometimes for some sites, you do have lots of tests to run and things like that, and they take forever. So you can split that out and have 2 jobs, one that is like for every commit, and then one that's like, I'm deploying to prod, do everything for me. And the other cool thing with Jenkins that GitLab, I think, kind of has this now. Ansible has AWX, which is similar but a little different. A lot of the tools are getting up to speed on it, but Jenkins is pretty good about, like, if you have a QA team, that they should only have access to QA environments and QA jobs. And if you have like a Java team that should only do Java things and a PHP team that does Drupal things, you can split that access up pretty easy. You can use Jenkins folders and Jenkins tabs in the interface to sort things a little better. So that is one thing that I like about Jenkins. If you have a large team of people, it's pretty good for that case. Someone else has a question?
So with your sample, does it have some of those build configs in it, just for like reference?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's another thing I completely forgot to mention. So as I said, if you're developing in production, I don't like doing that ever. So what I do, and since like your entire Jenkins history and everything is in the Jenkins home folder, to get those in your code base, all you have to do is create a jobs folder in your Jenkins code base and stick all the config files. So this is the config file for the bhat run test that I just ran. You can see the script is in here. They're XML files. That's what that's what Jenkins uses, and you can see all the things that it's doing. So I log into the server, I copy the config file out of that job and put it in my code base. And then in Ansible, there's let's see, where is it? So there's an Ansible task right here that literally just copies that jobs folder to the Jenkins home jobs folder, and that's it. And you can have structures and folders in there. Doesn't matter. One cool thing too is with the way that Ansible's copy module works, if you have like 4 jobs under version control, and somebody had to create an emergency job on Jenkins, and you push an update, it won't delete that job because it's not in your local code base. It'll leave that there. That's also kind of a curse, because if somebody's going rogue and adding jobs on your live Jenkins server, you have to like scold them and delete it yourself. But that's how that's set up. So all these jobs are in the code base. You guys can access them. I'm going to be making them like, I think right now I have, this is hard-coded, the list on this one. Yeah, this list is hard-coded, so if you tried running this on your site, it's like, I don't have jeffgeerling.com, that's stupid.
We have Drupal VM running in prod for our Drupal commerce demos, and we have a multi-site for each payment gateway. And like this is, I have a hack job like Circle CI set up, but I want more control and backups, and this is.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is literally what I'm moving all my stuff to, because I have an old Jenkins server, but that was when I was first learning Jenkins, and it was one of. Where is that? That was one of these servers. It is one of these servers. It hasn't been hacked, and I keep it updated, but it's just not in good shape. But yeah, I'm going to make this. This will be a template instead of a just straight up XML file, and the list of servers will be a configuration variable.
And the nice thing with Jenkins, if you're using Docker, you can add a Jenkins container and map your local folder and run all the jobs directly on your local environment before you go live.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way that I have this set up is it uses a Docker container as the base. So if I go to Docker Compose, it grabs a copy of Ubuntu 16. I actually just added 18.04 yesterday, so it probably works on there. I haven't tested the Jenkins role yet. But anyway, it grabs Ubuntu 16 with Ansible inside it already, so that you can run this playbook inside the Docker container and set up all the services. And it has like a mock systemd set up in there, so you can run it as if it were a live server. One thing that does require is that you use the privileged option in Docker, which some people are a little nervous about, but as long as you don't open up access to your computer to the outside, it's not, I don't feel it's a big deal. Any other questions? Yeah.
What was the plugin that shows in console the timestamps of each?
I think it's called Timestamper. It's in, let me look at the config list here. Timestamper, yeah. And so this setup also, the way that my Jenkins role works is you give it a list of plugins and it'll install them all for you, so you don't have to go in that list and check a bunch of boxes and click install. So the ones that I always use is Git, because everything I do is with Git. ANSI color adds colors to the console, otherwise it's always black and white, and I really hate black and white. I like color, although Dr. Strangelove is black and white, so silly way to name this presentation. Role strategy is the one that gives you the ability to have good permissions broken out by different roles. Parameterized scheduler lets you have parameters in your schedules so that you can have multiple schedules on one job that do different things. Timestamper adds the timestamps. WS cleanup is workspace cleanup, and that makes it easy. Like a lot of people end up like writing a thing that says like rm-rf everything inside this folder. But A, that's dangerous because you could have the wrong path. Like what if you CD'd into a different folder and you deleted something you didn't want to? And B, if something in your job fails and it doesn't get to that point, then you're out of luck. Jenkins also has the ability, I think I have it in here, you can run a task after the build, a post-build task. Whoops, I don't know what I just did. A post-build task, and you can say, it uses regular expressions to say like, when should I run? So in this case, I always want it to run, so I have dot asterisk, which means no matter what the output says, always do this. And I have it remove the Docker container. Because even if my job fails, I want it to remove that Docker container so I don't have like 1,000 Docker containers, which I accidentally did a couple years ago. And then that filled up the disk and the RAM and the CPU. The Jenkins server died and it was like not running jobs for a day. And then, anyway, so now I always make sure I remove Docker containers after the job's over. Because if you have a job that starts failing that runs them, you end up with lots of Docker containers. Why is the CPU? My CPU is still going insane. I don't know why. Let's see. Probably still something in Docker. Yeah, Docker's doing something annoying. Anyways, any other questions? What time is it? We're good on time, I think. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Hopefully.